Hello to everyone. You are most welcome to this video. This is a lecture on Immanuel Kant and a review of Chapter 8 of Poemon's Introduction to Ethics. In red here, I have what I consider to be the key learning for our talk tonight. And you will probably see this, well, you will see this on an exam. Kant is often talked about as a deontologist. Uh, Deon is the Greek word for duty. And most Anglo-American scholars tend to treat Kant as a duty ethics uh, person, and he simply is not. Uh, Part of the misunderstanding, I think, is just the flat way that most scholars who are not Greek friendly or haven't done any work in Greek just simply don't understand the etiology, the origin of the word deontology. Deon is from the Greek. The best translation that I can come up with is necessity. And I guess that's kind of the convoluted way people get duty out of it. But in Greek, deon is a logical indicator. An example of this would be in the mathematical equation 2 plus 2 equals 4. The equal sign, putting that in quotation marks, would be an example of a deon. It's true, 4 is true, simply because of what we mean by 2 and plus, and of course another 2. So once you have 2 plus 2, you by necessity have 4. I guess you could argue that you're duty bound to come up with 4, but it's more logically necessary than that. So deontology is not a good way to describe Kant's ethics. Even though Professor Poemon doesn't treat it the way I do, I think he recognizes the same phenomenon because the title of chapter 8 is Kant and Deontological Theories. So I think he draws a distinction between Kant being a strict deontologist, which he's not. So just a little caveat as we start out, but probably the most important thing that I can teach you at this point is not to fall into the trap that most people fall into. And we want to do that because Kant is probably the most significant interpreter of moral philosophy in the history of human thinking. He's one of the most important thinkers. He comes out of a tradition that subscribed in large mark to the teaching of René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher. And sort of the essence of Descartes, I guess, is you'll hear the phrase sometimes cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So the great gift of Descartes to philosophy tradition is that one can doubt much except the fact that he or she is doing the thinking. And from that, Descartes rebuilds the external world. So from the fact that I am thinking, I think I am because I am thinking. So the very essence of metaphysics gets proved simply in the individual reflection. And so Descartes patterns the entire universe on what he calls innate ideas. Intuitions is what the medievals called it. St. Thomas refers to it as intuitiones, from which we get our word intuition. So there are basic intuitions that are the essence of knowledge and reality, for that matter of fact. So from Descartes, we get Leibniz, who was a German philosopher and mathematician, and Christian Wolff, Leibniz's follower, and then the teachers of Kant. So Kant's really connected historically back to Descartes, and inherits what's called rationalism that we will discuss in a few minutes. So he's taught in the rationalistic philosophy corpus, but he's also very familiar with Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley, but it looks like it would be Berkeley, but it's Berkeley, who was an English idealist, and Hume, David Hume, Scottish philosopher. Now, Berkeley is an idealist, and I think this is a key piece of Kant here. This is where he sort of transfers from rationalism to idealism, and I'll make this clear, hopefully, in the body of the lecture. But Berkeley was an idealist. He's what I would call a pragmatic idealist. Reality lies in the thought, but the assumption in Berkeley is that the thing is what is thought. So he, in many ways, follows Aristotle in this. So that's the reason I would call him a moderate idealist or a pragmatic idealist. Hume, on the other hand, is later. Hume is a skeptical idealist. Now, a lot of philosophers would argue that Hume is not an idealist at all, but I see him differently. I think that he is an idealist, but he's radical in the sense that we have this idea, but ultimately there's no way to connect that idea to reality. So it's impossible for us to know what reality is. We cannot just assume. He says that we make a habit of doing this, and by that he simply means we just do it, but intellectually we don't have any way of connecting thought and thing. We simply act as if the two are related when they are not necessarily related. All right, which brings us to two possible positions on metaphysics. Remember, metaphysics, as we studied earlier, is the question of being. So we can have two opinions about that. Realism, the object or item has a reality independent of the thinking about it. Aristotle is such a philosopher. He is a naive realist. He thinks that both the object and my thought of it are connected, but that both have an objective reality outside of each other that are connected simply by a mental process. And I've talked about this before. The essence of something triggers a response from the human brain, and that is the case because the brain itself, for Aristotle, is part of nature. It's not anything that is distinct from nature as it was in Plato. So that's realism. Aristotle is a naive realist. Idealism, the other position on metaphysics, says that reality lies somewhere else than objects themselves. The reality of objects is only the thinking of them. They have no reality necessarily in themselves. That reality lies someplace else. Plato is the prime example here. The reality of something for Plato is in the realm of the forms, which we said was non-mental, non-physical. Kant is going to be an idealist like Plato, but we'll see the mechanism that he uses to connect thought and thing just a bit later in our talk. So, as a philosophical technique, idealism has one major problem, and that is, what is the reality of the thought? Where does the thought come from, and how does it relate to the world of experience? We talked about that in Plato. That's where the myth of the cave comes in. Um, the soul that is inherent somehow in the human comes from the realm of forms and into the body, but we're sort of buried in the cave, and that soul gets used to the shadows and to non-reality, and gets so embedded that it has trouble recognizing where he came from. That's the reason you need a Socrates, who's the brave little guy that climbs out of the cave and gets back to the sun, and then comes back to announce to his brothers and sisters in the cave that there is a sun, that this is not reality. So what's the origin of the thought? Where does it come from, and how does it relate to the world of experience? So those are the two problems that idealism has to face as a metaphysical position. Realism has two problems. It has the reality of the object, because remember now, it wants to give preference to both the thing and our thought of the thing. So we have to address both. So we've got two problems in realism. We have to address the reality of the thought. We have to address the reality of the thing. Now, the interesting thing about Brother Hume is that he denies the reality of both realism and idealism, at least as he undertook it in Berkeley's English tradition. So he is a skeptic. As a matter of fact, he is what most people would term a solipsist, solipsist, solipsist. He denies the possibility of knowledge. Knowledge is impossible, truth is impossible. Now, Hume was the first that I know of to construct what we know, how the process we know, into two categories. And Kant follows this. Kant renames it, but he accepts this from Hume. Hume talked about matters of fact. This is one way we know things, or we claim to know things, matters of fact, like it is raining or it is snowing. It's either right or wrong. So how do we decide that? Well, we simply look. Someone says it's raining, and everybody, or it's snowing, all the children run to the window to test that out. But from those things that we check off, yes, no, we can extrapolate nothing for the future. In other words, we can't. When we assert that it is snowing today, we don't know that to be true about tomorrow or this afternoon or the next hour, for that matter. We have weather that helps us with those patterns, but there's really nothing that we can say yes or no about tomorrow. And Hume says that even goes for things like the sun will rise tomorrow. We simply don't know. We can habitually say, yeah, it's raised every day for all of my life, all of my years. But from that, we cannot discern the fact that it's going to rise tomorrow. We can't prove that. It may not. That's the situation that the human finds themselves in. So Hume is very pessimistic about our being able to know or predict um, thought and future. So those are the matters. That's matters of fact, things that we can check up on simply by looking. Um, then he talks about relations of ideas. Those are sort of logical or scientific relations, pure logic, uh, complex mathematics as well. 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's relations of ideas. We get that by 2 and a plus and a 2 and an equal and a 4. That's the way those things are defined. Even something as simple as the very basis of all knowledge uh, that I labeled here as A equals A. It's a logical term called the principle of identity, which simply means a thing is identical to itself, or a thing is what it is. Those are true by definition, according to Hume, but they give us no information about the world. They don't tell us about, they don't tell us anything that we really need to know. We can get along very well, thank you, without relations of ideas. Now, Kant's going to disagree with that rather radically, and I think Kant's right about this. But this is sort of the picture of English empiricism here, and Hume is probably the most consistent of the English empiricists. He follows the rabbit down the rabbit hole of not knowing. And Hume was a skeptic in most matters. He was a skeptic when it came to God. There's a story about Samuel Johnson, who was his contemporary, a great English person of letters, and was always debating with Hume about God and religion. And Hume is said to have died after such a debate with Samuel Johnson. Good old Sam went around to visit David while he was sick, and Hume got so impassioned in the quarrel and the debate and the argument that he had a stroke and died. But he was, and Kant recognizes this. The danger of Hume, everybody assumed was religion. Kant very quickly saw that the danger of Hume was not just for religion, but it was for knowledge in general. It was for science. It was an attack on mathematics. And that following Hume, we destroyed much more than just our dignity. Anyway, let's dive into how Kant reterms these 2 and makes them 3. Kant called Hume matters of fact synthetic a posteriori, and he called Hume's relations of ideas analytic a priori. For Kant, they're logically true. So these 2 are appropriated from Hume, and Kant adds synthetic a priori, which is necessary for thought or thinking. So from matters of fact, Hume terms this synthetic a posteriori, synthetic in the sense that it's made up, posteriori in meaning from within experience. So it's made up in experience. Analytic is something which is true by nature, and a priori means that it is true prior to experience. So it's true for everyone, every place, and every time. It's impossible to to think of a world where a thing wouldn't be identical to itself. So that makes it in some way uh, a prop for reality or a scaffolding for reality, I guess we might say. Now, Kant adds this third thing, the synthetic a priori. It's made up, it's constructed from within the head, within the brain, but it is also prior to experience. It's not dependent upon us. Um, we're not the only one that has it. And these things, objects, whatever you want to call them, that are prior to and necessary for the expression or talking about experience are God, freedom, um, immortality of the soul, and later on we're going to see in his ethics the categorical imperative. So uh, these are the what he calls the postulates of practical reasoning. So you have to have these things in order to think about everyday life. These things are necessary. They're we can talk about them. They're inside our experience, but they are things which make it possible for us to have experience vis-a-vis our own expressions, our own conversation with other people. We might even say that they allow for conversation, that they are things which allow us to talk about the things that move us most. So they are both constructed within our conversations. That's important to keep in mind. They are constructed within our conversations, within our reasoning with each other, but they are necessary for that reasoning with each other. So they're both synthetic and a priori. Okay, I know that's tough, but think through it just a minute. I think you'll get it. Now, those were the two positions, realism and idealism, two positions um, on metaphysics. The two positions on epistemology, or how we come to know, are empiricism and rationalism. Now, I've mentioned both of these earlier. Kant distinguishes between two closely related concepts: the epistemological, that is knowledge related, a priori, a posteriori, before experience, after experience. So he distinguishes between those. And the semantic, the argument, the format, truth related, analytic, synthetic distinction. Now, let me define these as follows. And we could use these same descriptions. Well, we couldn't really for Hume, because Hume denies that relations of ideas give us any information about the world at all. Where we're going to see that they basically do give us an immense amount of information about the world, because mathematics undergirds, as we know in modern science, undergirds most hypothesis-based positions. So here is a proposition is a priori if it can be known or can be justified independently of experience. Now, the example here is triangles have three sides. We need not consult triangles to know this. In other words, we don't have to have a triangle in front of us. This is simply something that is simply true by definition. So that's what we mean by a priori. A proposition that's a posteriori, from inside experience, if it can be justified only on the basis of its experience of an object. And for this example, we would say the triangle I drew or the triangle I saw is red. We need to have a perception or some other means of experience, accepting a testimony from someone else that we trust or whatever of the triangle, this specific triangle, in order to know that it is indeed red. So this is not true of all triangles. That is true by definition. This is true of a specific triangle that we need to take a look at. All right, that's a priori, a posteriori. Now, a proposition is analytic. We're going to the analytic synthetic distinction here. A proposition is analytic if it is true based on the mere interpretations of its concepts. In other words, based on their meaning alone. So when we say all bachelors are unmarried, this is a true proposition, a true statement based on the very meaning of the concept bachelor and man. So bachelor simply means an unmarried. It's just another way of talking about an unmarried man. All right, a proposition is synthetic if it is made true only by something outside its mere concepts, i.e. by the objects of the concepts. So an example of this would be bachelors are jovial. This is not true of the meaning of bachelor alone. So some bachelors may be morose, unhappy, but it is made true or false by whether the entities referred to by the concept bachelor are also jovial. So analytic a priori judgments, that's what we've been talking about here, come from space and time, quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So those are the way we categorize analytic a priori. The synthetic a priori judgments are God, morality, and the immortality of the soul. So that is basically the breakdown of the metaphysics here in Kant's famous critique of pure reason that led ultimately to his critique of practical reasoning, which is the work on synthetic a priori judgments here, God, morality, and the immortality of the soul. That's his work on the foundations of ethics. As a matter of fact, he wrote a book called The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, where he lays out, hey, if you think this is complicated, you should read that book. I've tried to simplify this for you. All right, that's the scaffolding of Kant. Let me talk about the man for just a moment. He was an eccentric Prussian German, raised in a devout pietist Lutheran home. And some people even think that even though he ran afoul of the authorities about his belief in God, some people think he remained a devout religious pietist to the day he died. But anyway, he never went more than 25 miles from where he was born. He was renowned for his punctuality. He lived in Königsberg, which is now Leningrad. I don't remember. It was in Germany at the time. It was ceded to Poland after the Second World War. So the town now resides within, it's a German-speaking province within Poland. Every morning he went out for his walk promptly at 9 a.m. And he was so renowned for his punctuality that if the town officials, if the clock read 5 till 9 and Kant came out, they reset the town clock to 9 o'clock. So if it said 5 after 9 and Kant came out, they set it back. So he was famous for his punctuality. As a matter of fact, Leonard Euler, this looks like it'd be Euler, but German, it's Euler, like an O. One of the most famous mathematicians of all time invented graph theory based on what's called the philosopher's walk, where he traces Kant around the streets of the old city of Königsberg. Two things that Kant is famous for when he comes to statements about ethics, and I may ask you a question about this because I want you to think about both of these. Kant says there's nothing good but a good will. Now we talked about this earlier in the Good Samaritan laws, and they're based on this fundamental understanding of Kant here that there's nothing good but a good will. Sometimes circumstances control the outcome, and I have no way of controlling those circumstances. I used the example in an earlier lecture about if we're both coming out of campus and you see my car overturned in a traffic accident and it's on fire and it's turned upside down and I'm dangling from my seatbelt, head above the top of the headliner of the car, and you know that I'm going to die in the flames, a terrible death. And you come and you take your trusty Swiss Army knife and you cut the seatbelt, and whereupon I fall down on the top of my head and break my neck and die. You cannot be charged with a crime because what you intended was to save my life, and I would have died had it not been for your intervention. And I didn't die simply because of your intervention. I died because of the circumstances that surrounded the accident. So legally, you couldn't be charged with my death. And Kant says that you should hold your head up high because you intended to do the right thing. So there's nothing good but a good will. The second thing is that he says that ethics is nothing more than any well brought up child should know. I'll leave you to think about that and the way you the way you raise your own children. He says that ethics, I guess he says by this that ethics is simple. In some of my talks on Kant, I suggest that he probably he was right about science and mathematics and their relationships. As a matter of fact, I think I've even talked in earlier lectures in other classes about tracing the theory of relativity all the way back to Kant. Kant is metaphysically and epistemologically, he is the philosopher of physics. He's the philosopher, he's Newton's philosopher, I guess we might say. He provides the philosophical underpinnings of Newtonian physics, but at the same time, with his understanding of space and time as being the main categories through which we understand, if we go back up here, the analytic a priori judgment, space and time I listed first, quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So in his insistence upon space and time being the major construct by which the human brain places a template on reality, he actually gives us the background allowing for both indeterminacy and the theory of relativity. So he's is at the same time the philosopher of Newton and the philosopher beyond Newton um, of, of contemporary physics. So he's a pretty slick character, but he's also the probably he brings the same precision to to ethics and moral theory. Now, I said before that he's probably right, but he's so smart. He gives ethics the same sort of connection, mathematical connection that he gives metaphysics and epistemology. So he sort of requires, I guess, the common folk to become physicists in order to understand what ought I to do. And so that fails the practicality criteria. It's universal, yes. Uh, but is it practical and is it easily taught? And I must say no. But is it logically correct? Yes. So if the measure of an ethic is its consistency and its logicity, then Kant is your guy. If it's something that can be easily explained to your neighbor about what he or she ought to do, this may be a little bit more than they can take. So anyway, understand well brought up child in that connection. Um, maybe if we did teach our children basic goodness, we would need to teach them the physics of basic goodness. Just a thought. So let's go back to the analytic synthetic argument side here. Kant's teacher was Martin Knudsen, who was a student of Wolff, who was a student of Leibniz, who was not a student, but at least connected to much of Descartes' thinking. Now, Kant says that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. In other words, he alerted him. Hume alerted Kant to two things: that rationalism by itself simply could not account for reality, and that skepticism by itself was a dead end leading to nihilism or nothingness. But he did accept that we cannot know the thing in itself. And now this is important here. He follows Hume in this regard. We cannot know the thing in itself. We cannot know for sure that the table that your computer is placed on is really a table. You don't know if your computer is real or not. We cannot know the thing in itself. Now that goes for Kant's very consistent here. That goes not only for God, which Hume had said we cannot know directly, but that even goes for simple objects like teacups and computers and tables and chairs. We cannot know the thing in itself. We can only know our interpretation of that thing. That's whether we're talking about gods or tables. We simply don't know. We know only by the judgment, by the thought process of bringing this to terms. It's Beurteilung in German, which means to bring forward. It's translated as judgment, but it simply means to bring something forward, to deposit something, I guess we might say. Now, and in doing that, we check in with each other. So I say to you, we're in a room together and there's a table in the center of the room. And I say to you, do you see that table? Yes, I see that table. Now, this goes whether we understand, whether we speak the same language or not. Uh, yes, I see the table or the tish or the tableau or whatever we call it. We can get through those, what we mean by words. Does it have four legs? Yes, it has four legs. Is it brown? Yes, it is brown. So I've got this thought, you've got this thought. We check in with each other and we find out that we both got the thought. We bring in all of our neighbors and friends and thousands of people, and they all got the same basic experience of the table that we do. So it begins with our judgment, but it ends up checking with others. So we check with ourselves first. Yes, I see that. Yes, it's real. Then is it real? Yes, I see it too. So we began with Beurteilung, judgment. Then we check in with each other informally or by scientific analysis. Scientific analysis works the same way. Scientific analysis is simply a formal way of checking in, of scientists and experts checking in with themselves, but it forms the same basic way that simply asking your neighbor what he or she sees. That's called Vernunft in Kant, understanding. So it begins with Beurteilung, judgment, and it moves through a scientific process or the process of conversation even to Vernunft, understanding. So it's important to realize that the object has no privilege. In other words, just by itself, the computer is nothing. The table is nothing. The object has no privilege in Kant, but our fact checking does. Our Vernunft does. And humans are simply Vernunft creatures. They're simply understanding creatures. Inquiring minds want to know. That's the essence of the human being. We all are driven to do this checking in process. That is what Kant wants to uphold as not just common knowledge, but scientific analysis too. So common knowledge and scientific analysis are built upon the same Vernunft Beurteilung process. So what we see could be an illusion, as Hume claimed it was. But the great thing about Kant was that even though if it's an illusion, we can check and see if it may be a mass illusion, but we know that. We know that we all see the same thing. So if it's an illusion, it's an illusion. We can't control that. But the fact that we all see it means that we know an extraordinary amount. It may not be all that we want to know, but it's an extraordinary amount. We're all seeing the same thing. And that brings both community and individual certainty. So we still get certainty. That's important for Kant, or as close as we can humanly come. Now, just a little bit more here. The empirical tradition, the empiricist tradition Locke probably is the grandest spokesman for the empiricist tradition. He's a traditional empiricist, knowledge only through experience and not innate ideas. So that's the difference between a rationalist like Descartes, where knowledge comes through innate ideas, and an empiricist like Locke, where knowledge only comes through experience. Now, Descartes called this innate ideas. Descartes called it innate ideas. This is older than Descartes. Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas called it intuitiones. The Latin, we roughly get our word intuition out of that. Now look at the discussion of Poyman in the text, a couple of pages over from the very beginning, where he talks about act and rule intuitionism. This is where he's talking about innate ideas and intuition here. So there's the connection between the lecture and Dr. Poyman. Now, in all fairness, and I think sometimes the commentators on Locke forget this, Locke had argued that the possibility of experience and knowledge presupposed a natural order that was understandable by thought. In other words, it required a God that had constructed the universe in a knowable way. So, is the underpinnings of Locke's empiricism may be a little bit richer than most people give him credit for. As a matter of fact, somewhere I think he says the thoughts of God come before individual thoughts. In other words, God has to think this before we can think it. But anyway, our experience per se for Locke still comes from individual experience, which we build up on in a similar way to what we do in terms of checking in Kant. But Kant wants us to understand that British empiricism is simply wrong about this. British, and I think this phrase comes from Locke. The mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, upon which experience, perception, our perception of things writes experience. So there's nothing prior to experience, except adding that caveat that the world has got to be constructed so that it can be experienced. We'll leave that aside for the moment. Kant's very simple refutation of this widely accepted empiricist argument is that there is something prior to experience, and that is the tablet, the mind upon which experience is written. So you have to have something to process this before anything can be processed. So Kant points out very clearly that this is an inverted logic here. To say that there's nothing prior to experience is simply, logically, factually incorrect. There's got to be a mind there. There is something prior. The tablet itself, there's got to be a tablet upon which to be written. That's the genius of Kant here. And that's what he talks about, is what is that tablet? So the end of all of this is, while we do not know as much as we thought, we know more than what English empiricism assumed, and far more than what Hume's solipsism taught. Empiricism turned out to challenge even the skepticism it itself so valued, thus gutting not only theology, which it was content to accomplish, but also logic, math, philosophy, and humanity itself. So, to sum up here, from Kantian metaphysics and epistemology, we get modern scientific paradigms. We get the hypothesis, observation, repeatability, math model. So not only has Kant saved all of these things, math, observation, theory, but he has brought them all back together to form the modern scientific method. He's the father of the theory behind the modern scientific method. Now, he does the same thing in ethics, in moral theory. He writes the foundation of the metaphysics of morals, literally. That's the name of his textbook on this. He does the same thing for moral theory. Kant establishes the absolute integrity of the individual. In other words, you are the most important thing in the universe. You have infinite value, and by you, I mean all of you, no matter what the exigencies of your existence are. Your age is insignificant. your sex, all of these things are insignificant to your essence. That is what is of infinite value. So every individual person, taken as a whole, has no more value than any other person because all of you have infinite value. You can't get more infinite than infinite. You can't make an infinite more infinite. So I've written here that the 96-year-old person who's about to die has no more or lesser rights or value than the newborn, or vice versa, because every individual is a complete mathematical set of infinity. One of my old professors, Robert Paul Wolff, retired from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, wrote a book earlier in his career entitled In Defense of Anarchism, where it's not necessarily anarchism, but it's in defense of the radical individual, the radically complete individual, not the radical political individual, where he says that the main premise of the book is that the individual autonomy of the person is always greater than the collective authority of the state. So we concentrate on person by person, not as collective wholes. We're not collectivists when we're Kantians. We focus in on the individual and the importance, the radical importance of that individual person. So philosophy in general shares this, all the way from Aristotle, at least. But Kant really concentrates this notion of the infinite value of the person. There's a story about when Kant was old and in his 90s, his doctor came to visit, and he was in his wheelchair. And when the doctor entered the room, Kant struggled to get on his feet to stand. And the doctor was much impressed, and he said, "Herr Professor, you need not stand because I am your doctor." Whereupon Kant said, "I stand, sir, not because you are a doctor, but because you are a man." So the importance of the individual. Now let's take a look at the textbook. So you might want to pause the video and run and pull up your textbook. This is chapter 8, Kant and deontological theories. Make sure that you read the first part of the chapter here on rationalism and empiricism, where you get a sort of quick synopsis of what I've talked about this morning. Make sure that you read the next section, Act and Rule Intuitionism, and keep in mind that this simply is the Aquinian, at least the medieval understanding of intuitiones. It's also pulls out of Descartes' understanding of innate ideas, and it is an ethic based upon the old rationalist principles, which are not bad. Kant argues that they're incomplete, but they're not bad. Next, make sure that you understand the word, that you understand what intrinsic is. He talks about intrinsic goodness and the goodwill under the categorical imperative. You've got to know this section. This is probably the most important thing that you'll read in this chapter. Make sure that you understand the difference between the hypothetical and the categorical imperative. There will be a question on that, so make sure you think through that section. The next heading is the principle of the law of nature. 4 examples. I will say that you should read over that, but don't delve into it. And I say that simply because I think this is extremely weak. The examples he gives here are weak and easily contraindicated. So I don't, he's just, this is just, it's not good stuff. Um, that is also true of the counterexamples to the principle of the law of nature. I want you to read that, but I don't want you to get wound up in it. Um, the next section heading I want you to pay attention to is the principle of ends, E-N-D-S. Think through that. For sure, you want to know the principle of autonomy. There's a major heading section of that. It's about a page worth of reading. Make sure that you really drill down into that, because the principle of autonomy is what we've been talking about here toward the end of the lecture, the autonomous individual, the necessity of taking responsibility for yourself, self-autonomy, is the basis of all reality for Kant. You want to also pay attention to Sir David Ross here at the end, toward the end of the chapter, Ross and prima facie duties. And the next section after that is Kant and the prima facie solution. So make sure you know about David Ross, make sure you know about Kant, make sure you know about what prima facie means. And that's it. So I will be sending out a quiz probably Monday, could be Tuesday. I would like it back by Saturday. And again, if you have trouble meeting that deadline, let me know beforehand. And it's going to be about 5 questions, I guess. It won't be nearly as long as the last one because it's only covering 2 chapters. So chapter 7, chapter 8, utilitarianism and Kant. So I hope that that is helpful. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. And I will check with you on Monday with the exam. And by the way, start for the next reading, we're going to do chapters 4 and 9. That will end our semester together. So you want to read chapter 4, which is value in the quest for good, and chapter 9, which is virtue theory. This is where we've all been heading. So quiz on Monday, Tuesday. When you finish that, start reading chapters 4 and 9. I bid you good day, and I hope that this finds you well and that your life is filled with joy. And I will talk to you next week sometime on chapters 4 and 9. Good day.